Hello, welcome to another episode of What the Vlog. Me again. I'm doing a response to Dan's last video where he asked me about writing characters in video games. Now, I've written a lot of characters over the years. I love writing. It's the thing I'm best at. I'm still unpublished, but, try ever on. Boldly for the British Empire and all that. There's a lot of things to talk about in this, and I'm just covering a brief few. My points are basically in two categories. Firstly, general writing, and then some design points. It's been a few years since art school, but I'm sure I can remember some of the good stuff to talk about. Right. A good basis to start your character with is stereotype. Now, bear with me, this may sound counterintuitive. A stereotype is a good basis because it's something instantly recognisable to everyone. Now, I personally use the Briggs-Meyer method of personality typing as my basis. That's the stereotype I start with. This is based on Jungian personality archetypes. I don't know where it sits in the psychological community these days. Probably pseudoscience. Who cares? It's useful for writing. With it is a structure of 16 different generic personalities. These are a good starting point for any character. When I create a character, I go through sex, age, personality type. That's a good start because you know so much about your character to begin with. There are other forms you can use. In the anime industry, and I think the manga industry as well, it's pretty standard to use the Japanese blood typing system, which is traditional there. You could use zodiac signs, though I think that's less useful because you're tying yourself to a date. And I'm sure there's many other forms you could use, and many other sort of systems you could put in place. So perhaps you want to give your character a Kinsey rating. Now, this is your base, obviously, so this is where you start. I use personality stereotypes opposed to racial or physical stereotypes because I think it's easier to break out of a personality stereotype. Racial stereotypes and physical stereotypes are very hard set and hard coded and very difficult to break out from, because a stereotype is where you start. That is a familiar place for your audience to latch onto your character and go, okay, this is this type of person, and then you subvert those expectations by having that character grow and change. But you can use all manner of basis for your structures. I mean, probably the best thing for making quick characters I have is character sheets from roleplay games. I play a lot of Pathfinder, as you know, Dan, though the audience doesn't. I think that's a great system for making characters, particularly the skills. Now, you know everything you need to know about a character with a character sheet. That's the point of it. Let's talk about skills, because those are my favourite bit. There's a long list of skills. Class skills, non-class skills. So, one goes with the job, one's just other stuff. Character doesn't have all the skills, but every character knows something. So let's start with a rogue. A sneaky thief, hides in shadows, is all stealthy, or perhaps is a swashbuckling knave type character. Who knows? One of the non-class skills is knowledge religion. Let's say you put a few points into that. Why does your character have a few points there? Is it because he was raised an acolyte and escaped the church, and then went on his daring adventures around the world? Perhaps he's becoming demystified with his life of crime and questioning the morality of his decisions. Is it truly right to rob people? Maybe he's sort of a crisis of faith. Is he questioning if he has a soul or not? These are all interesting character things you can have. Another example as a stereotype character would be one I made the other day, which on paper was a very, very static dwarf character. Dwarf fighter, heavy armour, big hammer. I prefer dwarves to have hammers than axes. Makes more sense to me. He was a stereotypical dwarf though, so he had knowledge history. Lots of knowledge history, which isn't a class skill for fighters. He also had knowledge engineering, which means he knows maths. He was also a dwarven smith, but that was part of his character. I call him Evans the Smith, because he was that kind of Welsh dwarf. Forged his armour on his father's anvil. Knows all 18,000 of his grandfathers and grandmothers going back. He's lived in this mine, as his fathers and fathers' fathers and fathers' 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 fathers, apart from Uncle Ivan the Big Nose, who left and went to the city 300 years back. You know, he's a nice guy. He's well read. He knows dwarven history. He knows about honor. So that's another character. But then, over the course of the story, you can change that. Maybe he begins to question how he thinks about other characters. Maybe he initially begins out as quite racist towards, say, elves, as is tradition. But then you change that, and it's like, well, actually, those wars with the elves were perhaps more dwarves' fault, or orchestrated by another group entirely. He begins to question how his history was put together. Maybe his history was a lie. Maybe everything was fabricated. Because history is written by the winds, after all. Next point. Every character should have drives, ambitions, and goals. This is every character. How much you write about them is up to you. Now, realistically, your main character in whatever you're doing should not be the same person as they were at the start as they are at the end. By the end of whatever you're doing, they should be a different person, mentally and physically. They should have grown. They should have changed. They should be different. Not always radically so. You know, they don't have to go from the rural farm boy to Mechatron 5000, Defender of the Galaxy, in the course of a, 20-page comic. So that would be cool to see. Now, a character's drives are more internal. They're they're what push you forward. They're curiosity about the unknown, a sense of justice. They're slightly nebulous, but very important to have. Ambitions are also nebulous, but a bit more concrete. So, a person who sort of is driven by justice. Think Odo from DS9. But his ambition was to bring law to the station. But his goal was to arrest Quark. You see the difference. A goal is a very solid thing. A drive is a subtle personality thing, and an ambition is a nebulous desire, if that makes sense. Another important thing that I think a lot of people ignore when designing characters is where they sit in the environment. Because your character both is shaped and shapes the landscape they're born into. So let's say you have a character in a fantasy setting who's from a rural village that's in a religious country, but they're an atheist. How does that character sit in that environment? First of all, he instantly warps the environment from what its ideal is, because suddenly the religious harmony and hegemony is broken. There's someone thinking differently. Now, depending on your setting, that might cause different problems. In one setting, that leads to that character being burned as a witch. In another, it causes subtle political plays. So there's all manner of different problems you can have with that. But you need to know where your character sits, because a character from a rural setting, from an urban setting, are very radically different mindsets. Also, the country they're from, their nationality, they all shape them in different ways. What is their culture? There's a lot of thinking in that. But that's more world building, and that is a very different topic. And now let's move on to the visual aspect. The most important thing, I think, in designing a character in a visual sense is their silhouette. You need to avoid Weekender syndrome at all costs. Now, Weekender syndrome is something I just call based on an old cartoon from years ago, where all the characters were basically just palette swaps of one another. Different clothes, different hairstyles, sometimes different skin tones and gender, but they all looked essentially the same. Another example would be the main 6 characters from My Little Pony. They all look identical other than palette swaps and hair colour, let's be frank. So a clean, obvious silhouette is very important. Now, the best example of this in video games I know of is Team Fortress 2. In Team Fortress 2, every class is instantly recognisable. Most of their weapons are instantly recognisable, apart from the hats. Damn hats, ruining the silhouette. You can instantly tell who's who at a long distance. You can tell most of the time what weapon they're using at the distance. And this is very important, because if you have a clear idea of who's who and who's what, then you instantly know so much about the character. You instantly go, oh, that's the sniper. Ah. Oh god, he's got a Jazrael. Run! That type of thing. Another good example would be the first 150 Pokemon. You know, that thing behind for every cartoon. Who's that Pokemon? As we all love to do for the cartoon. You could tell 99% of the time who was who. That was good design. And also the style is important, because that can characterize a lot, because it's the same as genre. There's a lot of codes and conventions built into style. Now, if you're working within limitations of 8-bit and 16-bit, that's a bit more difficult, but you can still work style in there. So make sure to thoroughly think through your style and what that says. So let's say you've got a cartoony style, a la Wind Waker. Cell shaded, very nice. You can't really do dark and brooding, because that just comes across as comic, unless that's what you're trying to achieve. And on the inverse, dark and gritty is very difficult to do a comic character, unless you're trying to do something with a character that just sticks out like that. Another thing, idle animation, and sort of the motion of your character tells a lot. Going back to Wind Waker, because this is a wonderful example of this. The idle animation in that, Link sort of kind of goofs around, slouches down, goofs off a little bit. And that tells you about the character. He's, a goofy, slackery type kid. And you can convey a lot through that. Because one of the problems with video games is you're spending a lot of time with a character where you have very little direct characterization. So you need to use the absolute maximum of indirect characterization through their movement and sort of general design choices and how they interact with the world around them to get across their character a lot more than you can through straight dialogue. Because you may be spending 100 hours with a person, but you've only got 10 hours of characterization. That sounds like a lot, but it's not. Ideally you'd want 100 hours of characterization, and you'd still be struggling to get all you want across in the character. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for now. These are just very broad descriptions, and there's a lot more I can talk about. I may produce a series on writing for characters, world building, story design, all manner of things. I'd quite like to do that, to be honest. I might find time in the schedule for that. So I hope that answered some of your questions now. I know I didn't cover direct questions of Mary Sue and why Titus is a terrible character, but they're really a different vlog. So I may get to them another time. Thank you for watching, and good night. Stay beautiful.